Conservatives. They are about preserving traditional structures and values. At the end of the Great War, the Prussian system and thereby the German monarchy had failed. So what remained to be conserved? In Weimar Germany, there were two major parties which had to answer this question. Their answers turned out to be very different. For a conservative party, the Deutsche Zentrumspartei, German Center Party in English, was a strange construct. They existed throughout the Kaiserreich, but surprisingly for conservatives, they stood in opposition to Imperial Germany. This was not due to ideological reasons like it was the case with the socialist parties. In fact, it was due to religion. This goes back to the founding of the German Empire. With Prussia unifying most of the German states, a Catholic minority faced an overpowering Protestant majority. The Zentrum's policy was to defend Catholic rights against Prussian power by advocating for federalism. After the war, the Bavarian parts of the Zentrum decided to start their own party, but always ran in alliance with the Zentrum. This gave rise to the Bayerische Volkspartei, Bavarian People's Party. This construct has the same character as today's CDU-CSU alliance in Germany, which actually is the successor of the Zentrum and the BVP, only that the modern parties try to appeal to voters of all confessions. In today's Germany, religious differences between Protestants and Catholics are not really an issue. In this video, we will subsume the Bavarian party and concentrate on its bigger counterpart. But there was another major conservative party too. It was the DNVP, the Deutschnationale Volkspartei, which means German National People's Party. Its predecessor before 1918 was mainly the Deutsche Konservative Partei, German Conservative Party, although members of other conservative or nationalist parties joined this new party too. If one could draw a direct line from the founding of the German Empire to the Weimar Republic, I would be tempted to say that the DNVP were the successors of Bismarck. The separating issue between DNVP and Zentrum was to a large degree religion. While the Zentrum was all about the Catholic minority in the south and west, the DNVP was mainly Protestant. Speaking of separating issues, let's compare the principles of both parties. The first paragraph of the Zentrum's program was as follows. The Center Party is the Christian People's Party that consciously aligns itself with the German community and is firmly committed to realizing the principles of Christianity in state and society, in the economy and in culture. It views a clear Christian national policy as the secure guarantee for the renewal and future of the German people. We see that religion is the top priority. For the DNVP, this is different. The freedom of the German people from foreign tyranny is the prerequisite for national rebirth. On free soil, a newly strengthened empire, reuniting the torn away lands, this is and remains the aim of all German politics. It's all about the empire and a strong Germany in the sense of international power. Let's go deeper into the programs. We'll start with analyzing the positions by looking at domestic policy. The Zentrum states that the authority of state and law must be upheld at all costs, thereby proclaiming the loyalty to the new republic. The DNVP sees this entirely differently. For them, a monarch from the line of the Hohenzollern has to return to unite the people. Still, the German federative states ought to be free to choose their own form of state. Both parties agree that the states should govern themselves as much as possible. Both parties want career civil servants running the state. Additionally, the DNVP insists that the Prussian state must not be dismembered. Interestingly, while the DNVP affirms the political equality of women, the Zentrum does not even mention this issue. Both parties insist on a Christian Germany. However, the DNVP goes a step further. They see the German mind corroding and attribute this to the Jews and too much immigration. On education, both parties demand a state-run education system. However, first and foremost, the parent should make the decision regarding school choices. Both parties would allow private schools. For the Zentrum, this mainly means letting the Catholic Church participate in education. For the DNVP, Christianity plays a role, but above all, German nationalism must be taught. Next, there's foreign policy. Actually, both parties start their programs with this issue. They agree that the Treaty of Versailles must be renegotiated at least. The occupied lands must be freed. No party clearly states how this should be done. However, the Zentrum insists on doing this in a lawful way and wants to rebuild diplomatic connections. In contrast, the DNVP calls for the return of a military draft and the rebuilding of the fleet. Both see Germany entitled to at least some colonies. They also see the German state as responsible for protecting German minorities in other countries. Austria is explicitly mentioned. For the Zentrum, the association with Austria had always been important. Even before the war, the Zentrum stood for the incorporation of Austria into the Reich, a hope which had been undone by the defeat of Austria by Prussia. Austria would have added a political and religious counterweight against the Prussian predominance. Then there are economic issues. The parties declare for private property. Both support women's efforts to work and want to ease the burden at home. Both parties accept intervention in the economy only if it serves the common good. In the case of the Zentrum, this means that they go on for pages touching nearly every aspect of life, stating how they want to economically intervene in it. The situation is similar with the DNVP, but they list special interest groups like workers, women, the middle class and country dwellers as particularly worthy of protection. Both parties clearly demand balanced budgets. For the Zentrum, this means handling the tax revenue as responsibly as possible. For the DNVP, this means using the central government's authority to take taxation to the limits. The Zentrum calls for a social safety net. The DNVP does not explicitly state this, but has a lot of policies amounting to the exact same thing. Putting all of this together, we get two conservative parties. Both, especially the Zentrum, refer to Christian values. On the other hand, the DNVP upholds the primacy of the German nation. Christianity is only part of that. The disagreements were over the form of state, where the Zentrum preferred the Republic and the DNVP the monarchy. We can find a very big difference regarding foreign policy. The parties were similar regarding the aims, but different in the choice of instruments. The Zentrum saw foreign policy through the lens of diplomacy, while the DNVP was willing to use any means necessary. The Zentrum's program put them at odds with all nationalistic parties. The Christian values also show in economic policy. Although both parties proclaim to be against taking influence on the economy, their programs are highly interventionist. The Zentrum's Christian values gave them a lot of common ground with the SPD. It was the social, not the economic conservatism, which made them conservatives. If I had to put the parties into a modern context, the Zentrum would not be unsimilar to their successors, the CDU, although probably more their CDU from the 1980s and 1990s than that of the last 20 years. They sat in the center of the political spectrum, without being afraid of shifting to the left if opportune. Their social policy was conservative due to their Christian background. Compared with other parties, they showed at least some restraint when it came to interfering with the economy. The DNVP is a much harder nut to crack. A lot of the political program was plain nationalism on a scale one cannot find in the Western world anymore in any notable quantity. Take the most extreme conservative nationalist you can think of. Look at his social conservative ways and the interventionist foreign policy, triple all of that, then put them into today's Germany, and you might come close to the DNVP. Frankly, I cannot think of one fitting example. The political program also shows in the party's constituents. The Zentrum's voter base was made up of priests, aristocrats, farmers and workers, in short, active Catholic churchgoers. This meant that it was anti-bourgeois and anti-capitalistic. Ideologically, this put them in opposition to the dominating forces in Old Prussia, the National Liberals. After the war, state and union officials gained power in the party on cost of the nobility. This was equivalent to a shift to the left and put the Zentrum well in the political center. In contrast, the DNVP was the party of big landowners east of the river Elbe, which means Prussia. Mostly they were noblemen, bound to a military career. During the Republic, the nobility retained their influence. With the end of the war, this faction had lost the backing of the monarchy and had to widen its political spectrum by cooperating with lots of smaller conservative parties. This changed its social structure. For instance, in 1912, nearly 40% of the members of parliament were nobility and nearly half big landowners. In 1919, both numbers were around 10%. Top civil servants and big business owners took the vacant places. In 1933, nearly half of the DNVP's members of parliament were civil servants. One important faction that must not be overlooked were veterans from the Great War. The DNVP was closely associated with the Stahlhelm, steel helmet, a sizable veterans organization which also protected the party's gatherings through a subgroup, the Bismarckbund. When we look at what the parties did in politics, we immediately find one big difference. The Zentrum was part of every cabinet from 1919 to 1932. So talking about the Weimar governments without talking about the Zentrum is impossible. In contrast, the DNVP mostly stayed in opposition and only had ministers in government for around 1 year in 1925, 1.5 years in 1927-28, and very shortly in 1930. When we look at the most important waypoints of Germany, this necessarily describes the Zentrum's positions, and we can only focus on the DNVP's reaction towards them. Gloriously, the DNVP began its time in the Weimar Republic with an attempted coup d'état. In 1920, under the patronage of former Marshal Ludendorff, a military conspiracy aimed at creating an authoritarian state by toppling the acting government. Followed by a direct election of the president, preferable Hindenburg, this might have led to the recreation of the monarchy. Wolfgang Kapp would become the new chancellor, which is why the coup attempt is called the Kapp Putsch. Parts of the socialist cabinet left Berlin for Dresden, others stayed. The military got control of the governmental district in Berlin. Nevertheless, the coup attempt was not successful. The SPD government ordered a general strike. Most military support came from East Germany, but there the workers armed themselves, thereby binding military forces. Other political parties were unwilling to join in support of Kapp, and his coup attempt failed. The electorate seems to have been drawn to the DNVP's active opposition to the Republic. In the 1920 elections, they grew their share of votes by half. The Zentrum lost a little bit compared to the first election in 1919, while the BVP gained slightly. In 1922, tensions with the victorious powers in the Great War reached a new high. Britain and in particular France demanded new taxes to pay for reparations. This led to the Conference of Genoa, but not to any results. Instead, the DDP foreign minister Rathenau created a treaty that normalized the relationship with the Soviet Union in the Rapallo Agreement, thereby securing Germany's back, but angering the former Entente. While all of this happened under the Zentrum Chancellor Wirth, the DNVP was the only party of which some members of parliament voted against the Treaty of Rapallo. In general, the party's stance was reluctant and the leadership remained neutral. The consequences were harsh, and what followed was even harsher. The occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian forces in January of 1923 was a direct reaction to the treaty with the Soviets. Long story short, the German government called for strikes against the occupiers and printed large amounts of banknotes to finance those. What happens when one increases the quantity of money? Right, inflation. In this case, even hyperinflation. The DNVP wanted to employ military force to push the French out while toppling the Weimar government. This plan never was implemented because of the lackluster support of Hitler, who was needed to gain Bavaria. Speaking of Hitler, There is no evidence that the DNVP even knew about Hitler's beer hall putsch in November 1923. Bavarian minister-president was Gustav Ritter von Kahr from the Bavarian People's Party, which was the Zentrum subsidiary in Bavaria. He put down Hitler's coup with military force. DNVP officials tried to help negotiate a settlement between the Nazis and the Bavarian government, but to no avail. In the May election of 1924, the DNVP's share rose to 19.5%, while the Zentrum fell a bit to 13.4%. Adding political alliances, this made the DNVP the biggest faction in the parliament. Since the hyperinflation had economically destroyed many of the nationalists' constituency and the Dawes Plan was up for discussion, the pressure to take on government responsibilities was high. The Dawes Plan aimed at enabling Germany to pay its reparations on a sustainable basis. However, the DNVP could not bring itself to cooperate with the Zentrum and the Liberals, who were seen as too friendly to the former enemies, and kept strategic ambiguity instead. In the end, the DNVP split, putting the Dawes Plan barely over the necessary threshold of votes. The next election followed soon. In the December 1924 election, the result of the Zentrum hardly changed. The DNVP with 20% came in second behind the SPD. Finally, it put 3 ministers in the government under Chancellor Luther. Next came the first presidential election in 1925. The Zentrum ran Wilhelm Marx, one of the former chancellors. In the first vote, he received slightly below 15%, which was around the typical amount for the Zentrum. The BVP ran its own candidate, Heinrich Held, who also received the amount of votes typical for the BVP. The DNVP supported the liberal DVP candidate Karl Jahres. He came close to 39%. The ensuing stalemate led to new coalitions. The SPD and DTP joined in the support of Zentrum candidate Marx. Confronted with the losing situation, the DNVP totally switched the strategy, dragged a resisting Hindenburg out of retirement, and built a right-wing coalition with the DVP behind him. The Zentrum split with the BVP continued when the Bavarians decided to support Hindenburg too. This boosted Hindenburg to the top. However, the DNVP's participation in government was short. In October 1925, the liberal foreign minister Stresemann negotiated the Locarno Treaty, which fixed the western border with France and Belgium. The DNVP, under the pressure of the more radical wing, could not come to terms with that, and the party left the coalition after roughly 9 months without anything to show for. The DNVP's failure in government was the harbinger of change. Through internal intrigues, Alfred Hugenberg, owner of a media empire, became the leader of the DNVP. Hoping to take the position of chancellor soon by leveraging Hindenburg's power as president, the DNVP rejoined the government. However, in order to be accepted by the former Zentrum candidate Chancellor Wilhelm Marx, they had to recognize the validity of the constitution, as well as the Locarno Accords. Of all the problems Germany had, the Marx cabinet and therefore the DNVP's participation came to an end, due to a fight over educational policy. In this case, Zentrum and DNVP were of the same mind. They intended to separate education along the denominational lines. This was impossible for the liberals, who preferred a centralized and monopolized school system. The bill was withdrawn and the cabinet broke apart. This cost both conservative parties in the election of 1928. The Zentrum lost another 1.5 points and the DNVP sagged to 14.2%. In 1929 the Dawes Plan was changed into the Young Plan, which stretched the reparations until 1988 and made the last French forces leave the Rhineland. Although the DNVP had half-heartedly accepted the Dawes Plan, they now mobilized against the Young Plan. The nationalist wing initiated a referendum against the Young Plan, which would have mandated prison sentences for ministers trying to implement it. This attempt failed, but marked a radicalization in the DNVP's nationalist tendencies. In the following years, 2 smaller parties split from the DNVP due to its radicalization. In the 1930 election, the DNVP halved, while the NSDAP exploded to 18%. The Zentrum and the BVP remained at the traditional levels of around 12% and 3% respectively. Considering the worsening of the economic circumstances, the stability of the Catholic conservatives is highly impressive. With 1930 arose the question of how to handle the Great Depression, which had emerged since October 1929. The coalition of Zentrum, SPD, DDP, DVP and BVP were close to finding a compromise to balance the budget. It included keeping a tax on industry earlier intended for reparations, increasing workers' insurance fees and cutting benefits. Alas, it failed, and the SPD's ministers left the cabinet, although they agreed not to vote against the government. The president of the Reichsbank, Schacht, resigned over this too, and was replaced by the former Chancellor Luther, a liberal. The Zentrum's Heinrich Brüning became Chancellor and continued the policy of austerity. However, without the support of the SPD, his coalition with the DDP and the DVP did not have a majority. Instead, he had to rely on emergency decrees issued by President Hindenburg. At first, Brüning put DNVP ministers into his cabinet, but this led to a split between moderates and the nationalists due to a fight over Brüning's tax and agricultural policy. The weakened DNVP tried to ally themselves with the NSDAP, thereby drawing them and their voters into the threshold. However, at a joint meeting at Bad Harzburg, including paramilitary parades, Hitler showed clearly that he was not willing to be instrumentalized. The differences between the two conservative parties became visible at Hindenburg's re-election in the spring of 1932. There, the coalition which had brought him into office in the first place changed dramatically. In 1925, supported by the DNVP, he narrowly won against the Zentrum candidate. This time, the Zentrum supported him against Hitler, a communist, and the DNVP candidate Düsterberg, who was the leader of the Stahlhelm. Hindenburg won, but shortly after his election, the Brüning government was toppled. Many of the president's personal relations were from the Prussian Junker class, close to the DNVP, and General Schleicher, the commander of the armed forces, put pressure on the president too. Finally, he was willing to ask Brüning for his resignation and called a new election. In this election, the NSDAP won big, although not so much on cost of the DNVP, who suffered only mild losses. Zentrum and BVP even managed to increase their share of votes. Still, the traditional cooperation of Zentrum and BVP with the Liberals and the Social Democrats now was impossible. The end to the Zentrum's uninterrupted run in the government was a caesura that marked a fundamental change in the Republic. The Zentrum's ability to build coalitions was exactly due to the fact that they had a stable voter base, never experienced any splits, and had an ideological connection to nearly every other party in Germany. They always tried to find the lowest common denominator, which resulted in their ability to create coalitions. After 13 years and 4 Zentrum chancellors, this was over. Now, Germany was in a situation where a majority government was impossible. The nationalists with the NSDAP and the much smaller DNVP had no majority, and neither did the other parties, because the KPD blocked around 15% of the vote. Sometimes a coalition between Zentrum and Nazis was discussed, but Brüning opposed it, especially giving the Nazis critical ministries like the armed forces. From now on, Hindenburg would determine who would run Germany. After he had thrown out Brüning, the only option left for him were the nationalists or the Nazis. Hindenburg decided on the DNVP and picked Franz von Papen as chancellor, who had supported him in the last election. Papen created a cabinet of noblemen and basically continued Brüning's policies. The NSDAP promised not to vote against the new government, since the ban on the SA and the SS was lifted. In July, the DNVP enhanced the power further. After fighting between communists and Nazis, the government of the Reich took control of Prussia, basically staging a coup d'etat. By Hindenburg's edicts, General Schleicher, Minister of the Armed Forces, became ruler of Prussia. The Reichstag, elected in July 1932, came together. In their second session, in an unexpected turn of events, the communists brought in a motion of no confidence. The Nazis supported it, and so a new election had to be held in November. Again, Zentrum and BVP hardly moved, but the DNVP nearly reached 9%, although thereby remaining at a pathetic size considering that they were the government, with everyone else against them. Still, no coalitions, not even Zentrum and Nazis, were possible. Hindenburg, unwilling to pick Hitler, decided on General Schleicher as a chancellor, after some internal intrigues, although he preferred von Papen. Both Papen's and Schleicher's reigns were so short and full of intrigues, it is hardly worth talking about their policies. Just as Papen was toppled, so was Schleicher in January 1933, when even the DNVP stopped supporting him. Another dissolution of the Reichstag followed. All parties now were in a precarious situation. On the one side, they could illegally postpone the next election, de facto making Schleicher dictator for some time. This would mean strikes, fighting with communists and Nazis alike, and maybe even a Polish invasion. The Reichswehr could not guarantee to handle all of this. The alternative was to accept the legal chancellor Hitler. Hindenburg chose the latter option on the 30th of January 1933. For now, von Papen would be Hitler's deputy to keep the DNVP in. Although there was an election in March of 1933, it was by no means a free and fair one. After the Reichstagsbrand, the communists were all but forbidden. But other parties like the Zentrum suffered under harassment like shootings, brawls, and having the police forbidding their gatherings too. Still, the Zentrum's election result hardly moved. They only lost some younger voters. The DNVP, now under the name Battlefront Black, White, Red, referring to the imperial flag, lost only 0.9%, with the NSDAP winning 43.9%. The nationalists had a majority. However, this was not the full truth. The communist members of parliament had already fled the country or were imprisoned. This meant that the 12.3% would never vote, thereby giving the Nazis an absolute majority, with 288 of 566 seats instead of 647. Both Zentrum and DNVP would join the Reichstag session to vote on the Enabling Act in a position of powerlessness. Some politicians were already imprisoned, and the SA accompanied the assembly with chants. The Nazis threatened to fire all Zentrum civil servants if the party would not vote with them. In the case of the Zentrum, a battle ensued between former Chancellor Brüning and party chair Ludwig Kaas. Kaas won. In return for concessions, the Zentrum would vote for the Enabling Act. Hitler made all of the promises and held none. The DNVP never thought about rejecting the Enabling Act, but thought about demanding some concessions like the Zentrum. They also were in the unique position that some of the members were in Hitler's cabinet. They had the power to topple the government by resigning from office. In the end, the radical wing of the party threatened to go over to the NSDAP and thereby brought the discussion to an end. The Zentrum, backed by their rock-solid base, tried to consolidate under Brüning's leadership. However, their end came from outside when the Catholic Church came to an agreement with the Nazis in the so-called Reichskonkordat, which guaranteed the Church's right in Nazi Germany. Thereby the Pope threw the Zentrum under the bus. On the 7th of July, the Zentrum gathered for the last session and dissolved. Hitler was surprised about how smooth everything was going. He had expected much more resistance from the Church in Germany. Officially, the DNVP still was part of the governing coalition, and Hugenberg was the DNVP's leader just as much as Hitler was for the NSDAP. Von Papen was Hitler's vice-chancellor. All the DNVP's power derived from the authority of President Hindenburg. The Stahlhelm, the nationalists' fighting organization, had all but gone over to the NSDAP and were integrated into the SA. Under the pressure of chicanes like house searches, many of the DNVP's leaders signed pledges to the Führer and thereby became full and equal comrade in arms of national Germany. Just like all the other parties in Germany, the DNVP dissolved. The DNVP seems like a less radical and more conservative precursor to the NSDAP. However, we should keep one point in mind. The German nationalists, backed by the power of Hindenburg and the military, were the only ones who realistically could have stopped Hitler. In 1933, they seriously considered a military coup in support of General von Schleicher to prevent the Nazi Germany. In 1939, before the invasion of Czechoslovakia, they were ready to overthrow Hitler in case of war. And in 1944, it was them who led a real coup attempt against the Nazi leadership. The two big conservative parties both were an example of naivety at the end of the Weimar Republic. In a time of turbulences and inter-party conflicts, the Zentrum was the anchor of stability. It suffered no splits and always pulled roughly the same number of voters. They were willing to accept changes to the constitution in order to save the Republic. The Zentrum proved to be naive because they believed in the assurances Hitler gave them. The DNVP, on the other hand, shared the aim of the Nazis to end the Republic. However, the NSDAP had grown up with the Republic and thereby knew better how to play the political institutions to their advantage. In the end, the DNVP were not just naive, but idiots, since they thought that all the power the president gave to the government would land in their hands and were unable to consider that power could also be used against them. We can learn something from both cases. When it comes to politics, never be naive. Never, ever give anyone any political power. We'll meet again soon and finish talking about the parties of Weimar by taking a look at the liberals. Until then, stay critical, stay curious, stay free.